A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon. Juliet Smith from our sister station in Eugene spoke with one of the professors to learn more.
Somewhere in the dry dirt of a cave in southern Oregon, a team of archaeologists pulled out something that should not exist. They sent it to the lab, and the date that came back was so wrong they assumed the equipment had failed. So they ran it again, with a different sample, on a different machine. Then a third time. Every result pointed to the same impossible answer. Whoever left this behind had been standing on American soil thousands of years before history says any human being was here. And what Oregon revealed next doesn't just rewrite the story of human origins. It burns it down. The place is called Paisley Caves, a row of dry rock shelters in south-central Oregon. Researchers had known about the site for decades, but here's the part nobody likes to admit: they never dug deep enough. Everyone assumed the question of the first Americans was already settled, printed, framed, and hanging on a museum wall. But when a University of Oregon team finally went down through the layers, what they pulled out wasn't a spear point. It was preserved human waste, dried and hardened, sitting exactly where a person had left it thousands of years earlier. A find that humble doesn't make the evening news. But the bone-dry desert air of the Oregon High Plateau had done something no laboratory on Earth can do. It kept that fragile organic material intact century after century, while everything else in the cave rotted away to nothing. And locked inside, it was something a stone tool can never give you. Not a shape. Not a guess. Human DNA. When researchers sequenced the mitochondrial DNA, the result left no wiggle room. It matched Native American founding haplogroups A2 and B2, not some failed migration that wandered in and died out, but the direct ancestors of indigenous people alive in America right now, with a bloodline running straight back into the dirt of a cave most of the world has never heard of. This wasn't a curiosity behind glass. It was proof, in living genetic code, that the oldest chapter of the American story never actually ended. The people who sheltered in that cave weren't a dead end. Their descendants survived the Ice Age, survived the melting of the glaciers, and are walking around today. The proof of the oldest known chapter of human life on this continent wasn't a temple or a golden artifact. It was the most ordinary thing a body leaves behind. Then came the dating. Scientists used accelerator mass spectrometry, a method that measures the age of the organic material itself rather than the soil around it, which matters more than it sounds, because the usual objection to an impossibly old find is that the object slid down from a younger layer, or the dirt got mixed, or the sample was contaminated. This method cuts past all of that. It dates the object on its own terms. The calibrated result came back at more than 14,000 years before the present, at least 1,000 years before the so-called Clovis people were supposed to have arrived at all. You have to understand what that breaks. For most of the 20th century, every textbook taught the same tidy story. The first Americans were the Clovis people, named for the fluted spear points found at a site in New Mexico, distinctive blades with a groove down the center that made them lighter and deadlier. The story went that they walked across a frozen land bridge from Asia around 13,000 years ago, slipped south through a gap in the ice, and spread across an empty continent. First to arrive, nothing before them. It was clean, it was teachable, and it was wrong. Careers were built on it. Whole museum halls were arranged around it, with Clovis hunters standing proudly at the front of the human story on this land. To question the date wasn't just to question a number. It was to tell a lot of powerful people that the thing they'd defended their whole careers was a fairy tale. Oregon had just put 1,000 years between Clovis and the truth. And Oregon wasn't done. One date from one cave is the kind of thing the old guard can wave away as a fluke. A single weird result, contamination, bad luck. They'd done it before. But 70 miles from Paisley Caves, a second Oregon site was about to take that date and drag it down into something far older and far harder to explain away. Not a fluke this time. A pattern. The place is called Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter, outside the town of Riley in Harney County. University of Oregon archaeologist Dr. Patrick O'Grady had been digging there since 2011. 4 years, the site gave up almost nothing. It didn't hand over DNA, it handed over a clock. Buried in the soil was a layer of white ash, which scientists matched to a specific eruption of Mount St. Helens, dated to roughly 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. That ash layer became the rule of the entire site. Anything found beneath it is older. Anything above it is younger. There's no arguing with it. no shuffling the layers around. A volcano had erupted, drifted its ash across the landscape, and sealed a lid over time itself. This is why rimrock draw matters so much alongside Paisley. The cave gave the field a date and a strand of DNA, and skeptics could always mutter about contamination. But a volcanic ash layer isn't something you can argue with. It's a hard line drawn through the dirt by an event nobody can fake. Beneath that ash, O'Grady's team began pulling out things that weren't supposed to be there. 27 small fragments of tooth enamel, sifted from the soil one by one. One belonged to yesterday's camel, an Ice Age species extinct for thousands of years. Another belonged to Bison antiquus, a larger, heavier ancestor of the modern American buffalo, also long gone, creatures from a vanished world, the megafauna of the last Ice Age, buried in the same ground a human tool would soon turn up in. The picture forming in that trench was of camels and giant bison moving across what is now the Oregon high desert, and somewhere among them, a person with a knife. Then came the tool itself, orange chalcedony, a glassy form of agate, worked into a single implement with a curved cutting edge, a flat scraping edge, and a sawtoothed edge worn smooth. O'Grady called it an early Swiss army knife, one tool built to do several jobs. The little teeth along that serrated edge were polished, and that kind of polish takes a lifetime of use. Somebody carried this thing for years, sharpened it, cut, scraped, sawed, until one day they set it down in that shelter and never came back for it. You're not looking at a rock. You're looking at the favorite possession of a person who lived and died unimaginably long ago. Here's the part that matters most. The tool sat about 10 centimeters below the camel teeth. Deeper means older, so the tool predated the animals. When the lab tested the animal teeth, the camel and bison came back at roughly 21 to 22,000 years old. O'Grady didn't trust it at first, so he ran it again. Same window, 2 independent samples, 2 identical results. He later admitted it was extremely frightening to be holding material that old, because he knew exactly what happens to the careers of people who get it wrong. But there was no talking his way out of it. The animals at Rimrock Draw had died more than 18,000 years ago, and the worn knife buried beneath them said a person had been there even earlier. And that knife wasn't Clovis. It belongs to something called the Western stem tradition. Long blades, weak shoulders, rounded bases. That looks nothing like a Clovis point and predates the Clovis style by thousands of years. That's the quiet bombshell hidden inside the date. For decades, every ancient tool in the Americas was assumed to descend from Clovis, because Clovis was supposed to be the source, the first hand to shape stone on this continent. But a tradition that looks nothing like Clovis, and is older than Clovis, cannot have come from Clovis. It means a separate people, with their own techniques, were already here. So Oregon now had 2 sites, 2 independent dating methods, and 1 impossible message. But if people this old were standing in Oregon, the question stops being whether the textbook is wrong. It becomes how they got here, and how far back this really goes. Because the next clue didn't come from Oregon. It came from a warning that had been screaming on the other side of the country for decades, and nobody listened. Decades before anyone dug deep at Paisley, the first crack had already appeared in a sandstone rock shelter in western Pennsylvania called Meadowcroft, on a stream up from the Ohio River. In 1955, a local historian named Albert Miller reached into a groundhog hole on the property and pulled out artifacts that had no business being there. In 1973, archaeologist Jim Adavaggio began excavating the shelter floor, peeling it back 1 careful layer at a time, and the deeper he went, the older it got. When the radiocarbon dates came back, humans had been at Meadowcroft as early as 16 to 19,000 calibrated years ago, thousands of years before Clovis. In July 1980, Adavaggio published his findings and said the quiet part out loud: the Clovis first model was wrong. His colleagues came for him. Some accused him of contaminated samples. Others simply pretended the paper didn't exist. The resistance was so stubborn that researchers eventually gave it a name: Clovis primacy syndrome. It worked, too. Even now, decades later, one survey of working archaeologists found that only about 38% agreed with Adavaggio's dates, another 38% weren't sure, and the rest still reject them outright, not because the evidence is weak, but because admitting it means rewriting the careers of the people doing the voting. So when Oregon's caves and ash layer landed, the field was already cracked down the middle. Adavaggio had taken the hits decades earlier, alone. Oregon was the evidence that made it impossible to keep looking away. And once you accept that the timeline is broken, a bigger question opens up. Because 700 miles south of Oregon, in a white desert nobody had bothered to map, there were footprints, 61 of them, and the people who left them weren't supposed to exist. White Sands National Park is a field of pale gypsum dunes in southern New Mexico. In 2009, researchers crossing the dried bed of an ancient lake noticed shapes pressed into the gypsum. The closer they looked, the clearer it got. Human footprints, 61 of them, brutally clear. You can see the toes, the curve of the arch. Some are tiny, the size of a child's foot. Others belong to adults moving fast, almost running. This is a moment, a group of people, children included, walking along the edge of an Ice Age lake on an ordinary day, leaving prints in soft mud that the sun baked hard and sediment buried, holding them in the dark until someone walked across them again thousands of years later. The first dates came in 2021, from radiocarbon testing on the seeds of a plant called spiral ditchgrass found in the same layers as the prints, 21 to 23,000 years old. Skeptics pushed back with a fair objection. The seeds could have absorbed old carbon from groundwater and looked falsely ancient. So the team tested again, this time with conifer pollen, which doesn't absorb groundwater carbon. Same answer. Then in June 2025, a third study came at it from yet another angle, using organic material from wetland mud and shallow lake sediments. 3 independent sources, seeds, pollen, and mud, all landed in the same window, the height of the last ice age, exactly when the textbook insists North America was empty. Their footprints run alongside the tracks of Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, Ice Age animals frozen into the same mud at the same moment. Human and beast, side by side, sharing a shoreline no human was supposed to have seen. But White Sands tops out around 23,000 years. There's something in Southern California so much older it makes White Sands look modern. And nobody was even looking for it. They were building a freeway. A freeway crew in Southern California was cutting through soil when the blade hit bone. Work stopped. There were no archaeologists on site, no research grant, no plan, just machines and a road that needed building. What paleontologists eventually lifted out were the partial remains of a single mastodon, an elephant-like animal extinct since the end of the Ice Age. But the bones hadn't just fallen there and fossilized in place. They weren't looking at a fossil. They were looking at a scene. The mastodon bones showed spiral fractures, the kind of break that only happens to fresh bone. Old, fossilized bone is dry and brittle and shatters, while fresh bone twists and spirals as it breaks. Someone had cracked these open while they were still fresh, almost certainly to reach the rich, fatty marrow inside. This wasn't scavenging. This was butchery, done by someone who understood exactly how to get the most out of a carcass. Scattered among the bones were 5 large cobbles, stones far too heavy to have washed in by water. Geologists checked. Water hadn't carried them there. People had. Hammerstones and anvils, carried to the spot, used to break the bones open, then left behind when whoever did it walked away and never came back. Here's the number that empties the room. The bone was dated using uranium-thorium analysis, and every single test returned the same result, around 130,700 years old. Read that twice. The oldest find discussed until now was around 23,000 years. This is more than 5 times older than our own species is widely thought to have spread out of Africa. In 2017, the journal Nature published the finding, written in the most cautious, hedged technical language the authors could find, and it still landed like a bomb. Some kind of human species was in North America 130,000 years ago. Not modern humans. Not Neanderthals. Something the existing models don't even have a name for. Most of the field simply refuses to engage with the site, not because they've disproven it, but because it's too radical and too costly to too many careers to take seriously. Who broke open those bones? Nobody knows. It was some other branch of the human family, in California, more than 100,000 years before the story is supposed to start, doing something as intimate and human as cracking a bone for the marrow inside. If Oregon proved people were here long before Clovis, California is whispering that someone or something was here 100,000 years before that, which drags us straight back to the question Oregon couldn't answer on its own. How did any of them get here? Because the old answer, the one frozen door out of Siberia, is starting to fall apart. For a century, the answer was one word, Beringia, the land bridge from Siberia exposed when so much of the world's water was locked up in ice. One door opening once, everyone walking through on foot, the way the textbook diagram always drew it, with a single tidy arrow. It was simple, and simple is easy to teach. But Oregon's western stem tools don't look like anything that walked out of that corridor, and that's the loose thread that, once pulled, unravels the whole map. Start with a place that should have made it impossible: Crete. The island has been an island for about 5 million years, never once connected to the mainland. Anyone who set foot there had to cross open water, in something built on purpose by someone who understood the sea. Researchers led by Thomas Strasser and Eleni Panagopoulou found stone tools at sites on Crete estimated to be between 130,000 and 700,000 years old, resembling tools made by Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus, human ancestors from long before modern humans existed. That finding was load-bearing for the entire theory of how the Americas were settled. The whole reason everyone insisted the first Americans had to walk was the belief that ancient people couldn't cross open ocean, that boats were a late, sophisticated invention. Crete says otherwise. People were building seaworthy craft 100,000 years before anyone thought they could. Now bring it back across the world. Researchers tracing a mitochondrial lineage called D4H followed it to the northern coast of China, and the data didn't show one migration, it showed two. The first wave, around 26,000 years ago, most likely hugged the coastline by boat, moving from China up through Japan and out across the Pacific, camp by camp, following the fish and the tides. Not a desperate crossing, but a slow, patient drift along the edge of a continent over many generations, children of one camp growing up to paddle a little further than their parents ever did. The second wave, around 15,000 years ago, took the land route across Beringia, the group tied to the Clovis era populations everyone once crowned the first Americans. They weren't first. They were latecomers, walking a path others had already traveled by sea thousands of years earlier. Think about what that does to the image we grew up with. The Clovis hunters with their spear points, the ones standing at the front of every museum diorama, weren't the pioneers breaking into an empty world. They were arriving late to a continent already explored, settled, and crossed by people who came a completely different way. And the tools agree. The same stoneworking techniques show up across China, Japan, and the Americas, the same blades, the same choices about how to turn a piece of stone into an edge. That's not coincidence. That's a trail, a line of people carrying the same craft across the water, running straight back to the coast of China, the same separate tradition Oregon's western stem tools belong to. The knife under the ash at Rimrock Draw wasn't an oddity. It was a clue pointing across an ocean. So the tidy story is gone. The first Americans weren't who we were told. They didn't arrive when we were told. They may not have even walked. A row of dry caves in Oregon cracked the date open. A worn knife under volcanic ash drove it deeper. And footprints in New Mexico, broken bones in California, and DNA traced back to coastal China all fell in behind the same impossible truth Oregon found first. The continent was not empty and waiting. It was already lived in, already crossed, already home to people whose story runs far older, far stranger, and far more tangled than anyone wanted to admit. And it all keeps circling back to the same place, not New Mexico, not California, not the coast of China. Oregon. A row of dry caves and a wind-blown rock shelter in the high desert, where the dirt finally gave up evidence the field couldn't wave away, and the whole comfortable story started coming apart at the seams. Somewhere out there right now, in dirt nobody has touched yet, the next piece is already waiting for the next person to dig deep enough to find it. So who broke open a mastodon's bones in California 130,700 years ago, then set down their stones and vanished? Because the honest answer right now is that nobody knows.